Roxas, the 13th member of the organization. Roxas, a boy who was simply on his summer vacation. Roxas, the nobody of Sora. Born into the world without memories, a home, or even a name, Roxas had no identity of his own. It was in Twilight Town that Xemnas, the leader of Organization 13, found him and gave him his name and a place among them, a blank slate to be used for their needs as a tool, as a vessel. The first few days of life he was simply a shell of a human, unable to understand his origins, his purpose, and the world around him. There were constant eyes on Roxas, yet barely any of them would bring him closer to the answers he wanted. If anything, the answers they gave would only raise more questions. They wanted to achieve Kingdom Hearts, a goal he never resonated with or particularly desired, as it was put on him manipulatively. After all, he already had a heart himself. But one person would bridge that gap between Roxas and those around him, Axel. Whether it be because of his lost past connections, or the kindness of his character, or both, he was the only one that saw Roxas for who he was, a person, a friend, taking him under his wings. Through his connection with Axel, Roxas is able to take his first step forward, learning of other emotions outside of feeling loss, such as the joys, comfort, and worries that is found in friendship. And it's here where we start to see a difference in goals. If the organization fought to reclaim the most important part of their identity, a heart, then Roxas did not live to reclaim, but to find an identity of his own. And he shares this journey with a girl named Xion, who similarly to him had no memory of the past. But by building new connections between the three, sharing seesaw ice cream on the clock tower together as the sun sets red, they could start anew, finding individuality and a real place in the world, not just as numbered members of the organization, but as friends. If anything threatened the trio, they had each other to lean on. If only it was so easy. While both Roxas and Xion similarly questioned their origins and purpose at the start, Roxas, as the heart of the trio, was content and had ultimately found a meaningful purpose, to be with his friends and start over. Xion, on the other hand, who came to cherish their friendship just as much, would eventually, however, come into multiple conflicts with their origins and place in the organization, both of which threatened her place in the trio. Experiencing the memories of somebody else far more frequently than Roxas, she became more and more suspicious of her nature, reaching a breaking point when she'd come into contact with Riku, the first person from her, or more accurately, Sora's past. And as the story continued, she came closer to the truth, that she was a fake, a puppet, a replica. Her denial would represent the pride of her identity that she rightfully had, and that she was far more than the dehumanizing titles that others gave her. But when realizing that her very existence robbed somebody else of theirs with friends just like Xion's, and would eventually rob Roxas of his, she was driven to act, giving up her identity. The pain of losing those around her who helped give her that identity in the first place was far greater than losing herself. Axel, on the other hand, while wanted the best for his friends, often compromised their friendship for his duties with the organization. He, who saw his friends for who they truly were, not just as tools of the organization, still kept them at arm's length, withholding the truth from them. Though he did it with the intent to protect Roxas and Xion out of fear of losing what was important like he had in the past, ironically, his secrets to contain and protect ended up pushing them further away and doing the most damage. He'd burden it all, telling himself that he was a nobody, indicative of his choice to choose to protect the body over the heart. But in truth, they all had hearts. He was just deceived to believe otherwise. As promises are broken and fights happen, the days of eating seesaw ice cream and watching the sun set seemed so long ago. Roxas, who was closed off from his friends' burdens and secrets the most, found himself caught between the crossfire. And when he tried to find answers and a solution, they would burden their problems alone and push him away, so much so that before he could understand much of anything and help Xion, she was gone, resolved to end her life in a deathmatch so Roxas could strike her down and live. Continuously left out of his friends' burdens, lacking understanding of the full picture, and most of all, Xion's death would finally make him snap. The once so gentle, hopeful and trusting boy was now desperate and vengeful. While he once sought to understand, seeing where that led Xion and lacking the answers from the person he trusted, he now believed in action and force to get what he wanted, believing that setting Kingdom Hearts free would fix everything. His narrow-mindedness, naivety and lack of understanding led him down a dangerous path that Xion never intended him to walk, but given how he was treated, who could blame him? His friendship was everything to the identity we've watched him build, so now it was time to stand for it. Standing in his way, however, was Riku. They'd fight a close battle with parallel ambitions to revive someone they cherished, but as Riku misjudged and disregarded his opponent's character as simply Sora's nobody, Roxas gained the upper hand, proving that he was his own person. However, as the fight continued, Riku's perspective and reason to fight both changed and amplified, hearing the pleas of Xion. While they both briefly fight for the same connection, in that very moment, Riku listened to what Xion truly wanted, reaching a great understanding that Roxas lacked. In both respecting and understanding his connection with her, he was able to use it as a strength to surpass his limits, while Roxas was blindly desperate to get his life back, unable to hear her voice. And so, Riku won, and Xion was forgotten. Now that he had fought Roxas firsthand, he finally acknowledged his character beyond Diz's words, and pondered if things could have been different if he had met Sora. But the damage had already been done, and so, Roxas' summer vacation began. Here we have three friends whose actions conflicted with each other individually, one that desired to simply stay together, one that wanted truth and just, and the other that wanted to protect everyone. However, as we see at the end of the Dark Seeker saga, all three desires were possible and harmonious, and while it might have been difficult to find a solution at this point in the story, the ending proved that it was possible, and they certainly had access to the right connections. Though it may have taken time, convincing Ansem and Riku to see the heart in Roxas and his friends, and finding Evan to make the replicas, together their goals were certainly possible with far less turmoil. But here they failed utterly because they'd approached their methods self-sacrificially and alone, not together, completely ripping the trio apart. They may have fought for their connections, but what was left to connect if one severed or gave up their place in that very connection? And who's to say that these sacrifices to protect wouldn't do as much or even more damage to those who care? If everyone mutually sacrifices themselves, who is there left to protect? Void of his old memories, Roxas would once again start anew, enjoying the friendship he had so yearned for, albeit with different people that were the digital worlds as a means of surveillance. But the bond they shared was real to him regardless. As the days went on, however, history seemingly began to repeat itself, with strange occurrences from the past seeping in, denying Roxas of the life he wanted even in assimilation. As much as he tried to hold on to his identity, the world seemed to keep rejecting his existence to his frustration, and this fake reality was the perfect representation of that. Connected in circumstance as a special nobody, a tool, and as someone whose existence took from others, Namine was the only one who could understand Roxas, reaching out to him where her goals would have been better served by using him discreetly as she had in the past. The organization, Diz, no one paid mind to Roxas' heart because to them he had none. But knowing the pain of never meaning to exist, she wanted to befriend Roxas, not as someone who was ordered to manipulate him, but as someone who saw Roxas as a reflection of herself and had grown from her past with Sora. And through guiding Roxas where she could, she helped him understand his situation and accept it more than anyone. Rather than forcing Roxas into his fate unknowingly, she wanted Roxas to take that step for himself, telling him that he wasn't alone in his fate, but with her, forming a short-lived yet very close connection. Just as Sora had believed that she'd always be in his heart, forgotten but not lost, she believed that Roxas wouldn't disappear when returning to Sora, that they'd still be together, but as different people. Fighting to get Roxas back, Axel meets him in the digital world multiple times, but he'd realized that his secrets that pushed Roxas away would do more than just leaving the organization. He had completely forgotten Axel, the young man whose entire character would strive to live in the memories of those important to him, and burdened so much for Roxas' safety. And while he was ultimately safe, in failing to protect the heart and by compromising their friendship, he realized that his efforts were pointless. Betrayed by his efforts and unable to see the Roxas he once knew in him, for the first time, Axel makes no compromises, siding completely with the organization. At this point, it was impossible to turn back, so they fought. Roxas, who once fought to reunite his friends, would ironically be the one to strike both of them down. While he was victorious, in truth, he had lost. Heartbreakingly, the last memories the trio would have of each other would be of them fighting, unable to express their genuine desires and believing that this was the fate of nobodies. The only thing left to do was to confront Sora. Waiting at the pod room was Diz, the epitome of ignorance, denial and discrimination that plagued Roxas throughout his entire journey, never referring to him as a person. Enraged, he makes his last stand for his identity, but to no avail. To Diz, if he harbored emotions of justified anger, it was simply denial. If he fought, his strikes were hollow. If he felt, they were simply memories of someone else's emotions. All that was left was the boy in front of him who he had never met before, but indirectly caused him so much hardship, never able to escape the constant demeaning comparisons between the two for the world to see him for who he was. Call it defeat, or call it acceptance, in a tragically beautiful sequence, he manages to find it in himself to concede his identity in an act of resignation. And so, his summer vacation was over. When first experiencing this scene, this story, Roxas' journey can be seen as finding grace and peace in accepting one's fate, mortality and place in the world, given a next life through Sora as Axel says, which is ironic given how things turned out. However, as the story has evolved and Roxas as a character is given more context and perspective, we'd come to understand that the heart of his story was all about self-discovery and fighting for his identity, while the world rejected him to the bitter end. He was a tool, his memories were fake, he was the nobody of Sora. Yet after experiencing his story, we'd come to understand that none of this was true. His connection to Axel and Xion, a so-called nobody and puppet, were real. The memories that he shared with Hana, Pent and Olette in the digital world were real. His experiences and identity were real. Riku's eventual defiance of Diz, the subconscious connection Hana had with Roxas through Sora, Lee preferring himself to be called Axel, valuing his time as a nobody more, Ansem's change of heart, and Data Sora's story were all proof of this. But despite fighting so earnestly and being right, he still failed to prove nor accomplish his goal in his life, as he fought by himself, so the world was unable to acknowledge his existence that came with his connections. While Namine and Roxas were so similar in circumstance, how they viewed it was entirely different. Where Namine had little freedom to live a life and was driven by her guilt to restore Sora, gladly accepting her fate to fix the life she had wronged, Roxas had the opportunity to live his, and had no guilt or a particularly meaningful connection to Sora. But when the entire world seemed to be against his existence, and realizing that he had nothing to go back to, he gave in. The end of his journey was frustratingly sad and unfair, and what makes his final moments of acceptance so tragic wasn't necessarily because he accepted his place in the world or his destiny as a nobody, though it may have initially seemed like it, but in his first step of realizing that he had ultimately lost his place in the world after so long of fighting alone, willfully giving it up and accepting that he may have to live with the consequences of his failures forever. Although this temporarily changes when he realizes that Axel is alive, reinvigorating his hope. However, in the end, Axel couldn't bring himself to make any more sacrifices, and chooses to help and put his life on Sora, someone that reminded him of his old friend. Angered, Roxas forces Sora into dive to the heart, confused as to why Axel had chosen Sora over him. But after clashing relentlessly, he, for the first time, understands Sora's character, and realizes where he failed where Sora hadn't. While they'd both fight for their connections, he fought alone, while Sora fought with them. With weakened resolve, Roxas loses, finally accepting his defeat wholeheartedly, both in battle and character. But there is a silver lining to all of this, as for the first time, he begins to put his faith and trust in someone else to mend the damage, no longer carrying the burden alone or self-sacrificially. In fact, all three of the Sea Salt trio would put their faith in Sora, further exemplified in blank points, where all his connections look to Sora as the symbol of hope. But of course, the damage had already been done, and to a boy that was oblivious to Roxas and many others like we were in Kingdom Hearts 2, this would take time. The mark of mastery to Sora was all about understanding how naive he was, believing he could save everyone from their suffering with the strength of his past experiences alone, further accentuated in his rather gullible character. He'd also come to understand the true weight of the connections he was unaware of, sacrifices that were made to aid him in those past trials that made him so successful and confident in the first place, one of them of course being Roxas. Before this point, Sora is unable to understand him beyond the fact that he was his nobody, simply a piece of himself, believing that he had a happy ending, while Roxas was unable to convey how much he was hurting to others. But in realizing his individual shortcoming, he shares his story, and Sora experiences his grief, his memories that were as real as anyone's, and could no longer deny Roxas' identity that he rightfully had, a sense of identity so powerful that his emotions and memories would seep into Sora's life many times, just as it once did with Roxas's. The dreams of one would be the precious far-off memories of another. While it was the natural desire and fate of nobodies to return to their somebody, where did that leave those like Namine, Xion and Roxas? And they were able to coexist briefly at one point, so who's to say they couldn't do it again? Because just like the themes of darkness and nothingness that Sora himself has reinforced time and time again, the origins of one aren't indicative of where they truly belong. Sora would spend much of his time in Kingdom Hearts 3 searching for a way to bring Roxas back, while chasing loose connections would give him hints towards the answers he was looking for. It was only when facing his closest connection empathetically and together that all the conditions of Roxas' return without compromise of either existence was possible. Once more, Roxas would reach out to Sora for help, and he was finally able to line the pieces up between the two of them in their rightful places, as yours and mine, just as he vowed all those years ago. The return of Roxas and the reunion of the Sea Salt trio was a triumphant and cathartic one after all these years, but it wasn't enough for them to simply regain their lives. That was Sora's role that he was entrusted with. It was now up to the three of them together to find unity and take care of unfinished business with Xemnas, the man that had viewed the three of them as nothing but tools, the puppeteer of their tragedies. But together they will prove that they were more than just pawns, with wonderful synergy and choreographed combos in their attacks. Striking him down together, they were able to reclaim the final piece of their identities for themselves, represented by the recusant sigil in their names. While it would once represent their place in Organization 13 as Xemnas' pawns which were forced onto them, they'd redefine its meaning as their identity and the connection they shared with each other for themselves. After all, it was the very thing that linked these friends together in the first place. At last, the three of them found harmony with each other and a genuine home in the world, an emotional payoff of few words, just a quiet moment of healing, relief and serenity between three friends. In the end, they were finally able to have sea salt ice cream on the clock tower of Twilight Town like old times, and make it to the beach, fulfilling their promise with both Axel and Xion, and hang up pets and all that.